To learn more about earning college credits with study hall courses, go to gostudyhall.com or click the link in the description. In the mid-1750s, an 11-year-old boy from Nigeria named Olaudah Equiano was kidnapped and shipped to the West Indies, where he was sold into the slave trade. A ranking official in the British Royal Navy purchased Equiano, and he would go on to be sold 2 more times before he was able to buy his legal freedom, or emancipation, in 1766. Equiano would make a life for himself in England as a freedman, where he became one of the leaders of the abolitionist movement, whose goal was to end slavery. People of color and enslaved people experienced the horrors of slavery firsthand, and had been fighting for freedom for centuries. But advocates like Equiano rallied new groups and allies to their movement with the goal of abolishing the slave trade and slavery itself. And, thanks to people like him, British Parliament ended the slave trade in 1807. About 30 years later, they abolished slavery entirely. But like Equiano's path to freedom, the road to abolition was a long and difficult journey. Hi, I'm Rob Fuller, and this is Study Hall, Modern World History. First, let's throw it back 200 years for a quick econ lesson, because unfortunately, nothing pressures empire-wide social change quite like coinage. In the early 17th century, empires like Britain were still clawing their way to imperial and commercial success with the help of a little thing called chartered or joint stock companies. These were private companies with government support via a charter. These companies relied on capital from shareholders who held stock to cover the upfront costs of trade. In return, the stockholders would get a share of all the profits. The money was rolling in and making people rich. But since joint stock companies were set up as monopolies, that meant other businesses couldn't get a piece of that sweet, sweet money pie. And of course, these huge joint stock operations relied heavily on the labor of colonized, enslaved people living in the British colonies to produce this staggering amount of product. Up-and-coming entrepreneurs believed that England should move to a free trade system, which would ditch monopolies and open up all markets to economic competition, thereby giving independent farmers and merchants more economic power and spreading the wealth. One free trade proponent was Scottish philosopher Adam Smith. In his 1776 treatise, commonly known as The Wealth of Nations, Smith argued that monopolies weren't just a nuisance, they were morally bad and economically damaging. And although Smith definitely wasn't just writing an anti-slavery treatise, he also argued that process could eventually bring an end to slavery. He posited that if an economy transitioned away from monopolies and enslaved labor, the additional money spent on wages would pay for itself by increasing the efficiency of the workforce and growing the economy in general. Smith argued that slavery took away a worker's motivation to succeed. After all, why would a person work hard if they weren't getting paid and had virtually no rights and really couldn't hope for a better life? On the other hand, free laborers could use their salaries to make their lives better, and the motivation that came with that freedom would actually grow profits in the long run. If European empires followed Smith's lead, it would totally change how they functioned, at least in theory. But it would also threaten the wealth and influence of tons of Britain's richest citizens, which they weren't thrilled about. Smith's pamphlet came at a crucial time in the rethinking of slavery in England and opened up the abolition conversation to the economically minded upper and middle classes. But it was just one drop in the bucket. Towards the end of the 18th century, slave revolts, legal rulings, and the rising cost of moving ships and enslaved people ramped up the fight against slavery. And this fight, previously shouldered by mostly black abolitionists, became increasingly mainstream. By the 18th century, many Christians began to feel that Britain's economic success had caused the country to lose its way. They viewed the abolition of slavery as a way to steer Britain back towards quote-unquote Christian morals, things like sobriety, self-discipline, charity, peacefulness, and, not enslaving other human beings. These Christians formed a movement known as the Great Awakening, a non-denominational push for religious revival that swept across Britain, led by preachers like John Wesley and George Whitefield. Participants wanted to wake up Britain from its slumber of sin. And while the abolitionist movement and the Great Awakening were two separate historical developments, The two did see eye to eye when it came to ending slavery. The Quakers were one specific denomination to speak out against slavery, participating actively in the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade, formed in 1787. They were joined by the Clapham sect, another religious organization that campaigned for abolition. This sect was made up of elite families who congregated at the Clapham Parish Church, and both groups saw the slave trade as the gravest sin afflicting Britain. They worked together to organize rallies against the slave trade in one of the first mass protest movements in European history. They also sponsored research into the horrors of slavery and even organized lectures and gathered petitions demanding that Parliament end the slave trade. To which Parliament said, "Absolutely not." To make real progress, abolitionists needed allies with wealth and political power. So it was British House of Commons representative William Wilberforce who gave the movement political clout. Wilberforce himself was a recent convert to Christianity and quickly became abolition's biggest political advocate. Thanks to his lofty political position, he was able to exert his influence to put pressure on Parliament to finally act. But this movement wasn't just about wealthy political elites duking it out behind governmental doors. Abolitionists were a diverse group, including women, the working class, and currently or formerly enslaved people. In fact, for white abolitionists, the stories and experiences of enslaved people were crucial to peeling back the veil on the evils of slavery. Notably, British abolitionists partnered with a group of Christian African lobbyists who gave public lectures and wrote books on the slave trade from the perspective of people who'd experienced it firsthand. One of these books was an autobiography called The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olaudah Equiano. Yes, that Olaudah, the guy we talked about back in the intro, wrote one of the most influential books promoting abolition ever. It is considered the first bestseller by a person of African descent in Britain, and his story opened people's eyes to the horrors of slavery and the slave trade. Abolition lit was hot in the late 18th and early 19th century. Abolition? Another influential book was written by a formerly enslaved woman named Mary Prince. Prince was born into slavery in Bermuda. She spent her young life working in abusive conditions, including harvesting salt from salt water. And like all enslaved people, Mary experienced physical and emotional violence at the hands of her enslavers. But Mary wouldn't be broken. She attended church, took in washing to earn her own money in secret, and even married a free man, though she was beaten and imprisoned for doing so once she was found out. Eventually, her enslavers took her to England to attend to the family during an overseas trip, and it was there Mary seized her chance. She ran away and sought shelter with a missionary group who connected her with the Anti-Slavery Society. There, she dictated her experiences in vivid detail, explaining what it was like to live as an enslaved person subject to brutal working conditions and severe beatings. Mary's story, which was edited and published by the Anti-Slavery Society, became the first ever published book by a Black woman about her time as an enslaved person. And Mary's autobiography was crucial to the abolition movement already swirling around England, giving British readers a front row seat to the horrors of slavery. But slavery still had supporters despite the hard work of people like Mary Prince, Olaudah Equiano, William Wilberforce, and the Clapham sect. Notably, a coalition of wealthy enslavers, plantation owners, and sugar merchants known as the West India Lobby argued in favor of slavery. Sugar producers needed a lot of cheap labor if they wanted to keep their profits going through the roof, which meant more enslaved people working on plantations. So when things finally did start to change, it wasn't all at once. Under the leadership of Wilberforce, British Parliament finally abolished the slave trade in 1807, but it would be another 26 years before slavery itself was abolished altogether. That's because, while the English were okay with putting the brakes on the literal buying and selling of human beings, they weren't quite ready to give up the labor the country already had. These enslaved people were still turning a profit for England, and a hesitant Parliament wasn't quite ready to go all in on human rights just yet. They wanted to make sure that this new free trade economy actually worked before phasing out slavery altogether. But finally, in 1833, Parliament outlawed all slavery within Britain. A huge win, not only for the abolition movement, which is now known as the most successful activist movement of 19th century Britain, but for human rights as a whole. Of course, Britain wasn't the only empire that used enslaved labor, and even after it was abolished there, slavery had already affected more than just the economy. It had impacted the culture, religion, class, and sowed the seeds of modern-day racism. And even when it was abolished in Britain, exploitation and oppression didn't just disappear. The British Empire found ways to use their free trade economy to keep their newly emancipated subjects under control. For instance, low wages kept formerly enslaved people in poverty, and eliminating slavery in Britain didn't mean that every other empire immediately followed suit. Slavery was still alive and well in the US until 1865, and people like the Uyghurs in the Xinjiang region of China are still enduring forced labor today. At the same time, though, the abolitionist movement in England brought a new moral school of thought that was the first successful challenge to the scientific tradition that promoted racism. And even though the motives were mixed, the abolition of slavery inspired people to challenge other ideas and systems that were either no longer useful or downright harmful. If you're enjoying Study Hall Modern World History and are interested in taking online courses and earning college credit, visit gostudyhall.com or click on the button to learn more. Thanks for watching. See you next time.